A Sympathetic Crotch to Cry On is the 21st episode of the second season of 2.5 Men. This is directed by Pamela Fryman, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I talk about the episode and share some thoughts. And this is a really enjoyable episode with some moving moments, and I'll go through things chronologically. Loved the intro. Jake is playing on a handheld console, and I didn't actually know what console it was, so I googled it, and apparently it's a Nintendo DS. But he does refer to it several times in this episode as a Game Boy. So if anybody can confirm either way, please feel free to let me know. I couldn't find a picture of the back of one of the early DSs to do a comparison. So if anybody can confirm, that would be brilliant. He's playing on the DS. He eventually has his headphones on. And Alan and Charlie hear Evelyn coming in, so they run. But Jake obviously can't hear her, and she enters the kitchen, and he turns and sees her, and his expression is fabulous. And his response is to hide under the table. Absolutely love it. Evelyn is then sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the newspaper. She's reading the obituaries because dead people's families are going to want to sell their houses, and obviously Evelyn is a realtor. And then she reads the obituary of one of her former partners, Harry, who is, of course, a stepfather to Alan and Charlie. And she says that they need to go to the funeral. Everybody has a kind of different response to that. And Alan reveals that he's actually occasionally been in touch with Harry, sending him the odd card and things. And Evelyn is not very happy about that. And I can kind of imagine that would sting, especially when we learn what we learn about Evelyn a little later on, and I'll talk about that in a second. To find out that your son has been communicating with your ex without your knowledge might seem a little bit sneaky, even though I don't think Alan ever intended it to be like that. But I can kind of understand her initial gut response to that. We're then in the car for a brief period of time, and we find out that actually Evelyn didn't leave Harry, which is what the boys had always been brought up to believe. Harry left her for a younger woman, and we get to see a vulnerable side of Evelyn where she's just being honest and open and not really making witty remarks. She does, of course, get back into that pretty quickly, but for a minute or so, we just have raw, honest emotions about how she did love him and she didn't want to end that relationship, and I think that was really beautifully done. And this happens quite a lot in the episode where we'll have some really brilliant comedy, and then somebody will say something that's actually really moving and meaningful, and then the comedy will come back into it, and I think it got the balance really, really spot on. Unfortunately, when they do get to the funeral, Charlie and Evelyn kind of take advantage of the widow. Charlie is preparing to hit on her, Evelyn is trying to get her to sell the house, and Jake wanders off. And I think this is actually a really moving moment, very brief, but very moving moment between Alan and Jake. And I imagine quite realistic, and also I think a good way to handle this situation. Alan finds Jake approaching the open casket, and Jake says quite plainly, "I just wanted to see it." And Alan says, "Go on then." And I think that that's a really sensible approach, because I believe if Alan had said, "No, keep away, you're not getting to see a dead body," bearing in mind that's kind of the reason Jake went in the first place, I think denying that knowledge of what that experience would be like, which is clearly what Jake is wanting to find out, would actually do more harm than good. And I think a child, if it's done right, is never too young to start to get to grips with the concept of death. I'm not saying we should be telling 2-year-olds that their loved ones are going to drop dead without any warning, but at the same time, Jake is at an age where he presumably has a reasonable understanding of death. And I think answering questions and being there beside him, as Alan was, when he experiences his first dead body, if you like, is a very healthy way of doing that, and a healthy way of settling that curiosity. So in my opinion, and I'm saying this as somebody without a child and as somebody who has never seen a dead human before, so my opinion probably doesn't mean anything, but in my opinion, I think Alan did the right thing there. And we get a sweet moment with Alan and, well, in theory, Harry. We, the viewer, of course, don't see Harry. And then Charlie comes along and says something quite sweet as well, and it's actually kind of moving. And then it's time to give speeches, and Evelyn starts to talk about Harry, and it seemed like she was going to be giving this really lovely, moving speech. And then she'd say something inappropriate, and then she'd say something moving again. And then the inappropriate comments would come back. And I think this was Evelyn being honest and genuine. And there was also a point where she actually admitted she shouldn't be saying these things about the widow. And I think her reaction there was very, very believable based on her personality and based on Evelyn as a character. And again, it must have been really difficult for her to be giving this talk, maybe that's not the right word, a kind of eulogy for somebody who got away. Maybe he was the one who got away. Maybe she thought she'd be with him forever. And now she has to stand here knowing that he's no longer around and that he traded her in for somebody younger and then traded that person in for somebody younger. So definitely not a great situation for Evelyn, but they managed to keep it light and entertaining while putting in a few more meaningful moments in there as well. And then, of course, we end with Jake not being able to find his Game Boy. They leave the room, and then we hear the music, and the Game Boy is in the casket. Or whatever it is, Game Boy, Nintendo. He calls it a Game Boy. And it's a pretty light-hearted way to end what could have been a really heavy episode. But as I said, I think they got the balance spot on. There are moments where there's a lot of respect for the deceased, for the widow, but they also managed to keep the characters true to their personalities and, as I said, with what I believe are very genuine responses to the situation. I'd say A Sympathetic Crotch to Cry On is definitely a pretty good episode.